The chamber was thick with anticipation, the kind of atmosphere that made even the sound of shuffling papers feel loud. Justice William Alsup leaned back, lips curling into that familiar smirk, a look that had cut down countless attorneys and witnesses before they even finished speaking. It wasn't just an expression. It was a declaration, "I've already won." But this time, he wasn't facing a nervous lawyer or a timid witness. He was facing Representative Jasmine Crockett. Her eyes didn't flinch. She stood firm, her shoulders squared, a calm confidence radiating from her like heat. Where others might have looked down at their notes, she stared straight ahead, as if daring him to underestimate her one more time. Alsup let his smirk linger, drawing out the silence. A few chuckles rippled through the room, as though everyone knew what came next. Another dismissal, another moment where his authority swallowed someone whole. He leaned forward, ready to cut her down with a wave of his hand. But before he could, Crockett spoke. Her voice sliced through the silence, not loud, but sharp, deliberate. Each word carried weight, steady and precise, building pressure with every syllable. She didn't stumble, she didn't waver, and she certainly didn't bow. And then it happened. The line, the one that would echo across the internet, replayed in countless clips, etched into memes, quoted in classrooms and coffee shops. A comeback so savage, so precise, it didn't just challenge the judge, it dismantled him. The smirk disappeared. For the first time in years, Justice Alsup had no retort. His lips parted as though to respond, but nothing came. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Some gasped, others stared, wide-eyed. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they'd just witnessed a moment destined for history. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply stood, calm and unshaken, as though she had expected this outcome all along. But this was only the beginning. Because what led to this mic drop moment, and what would follow, revealed more than just a clash of personalities. It revealed a battle for dignity itself. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture. This wasn't just a courtroom exchange. It was a collision of worldviews, a test of who gets to define authority in America, the old guard that leans on hierarchy and intimidation, or the new generation that insists on dignity, truth, and representation. Justice William Alsup had built his reputation on control. In his courtroom, silence was enforced not by respect, but by fear. A smirk here, a sarcastic aside there, and suddenly the air shifted. Lawyers shrank. Witnesses second-guessed themselves. Everyone learned quickly that to speak in front of Alsup was to risk being reduced to a punchline. For years he wielded that power effortlessly, his arrogance disguised as wit. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't shaped by deference. She was shaped by resistance. A woman who had spent her career standing against condescension, prejudice, and the idea that authority automatically means righteousness. Every time someone tried to belittle her, she sharpened her edge. Every time someone told her to sit down, she stood taller. She wasn't stepping into Alsup's courtroom as a guest. She was stepping in as a challenger. And that's what raised the stakes. This wasn't just about one judge smirking at one congresswoman. This was about the symbolic clash between the way things had always been done and the way they needed to change. Between arrogance and accountability. Between silence and voice. The crowd inside the chamber knew it too. The energy wasn't routine. There was a buzz, an unspoken recognition that something was different. Reporters leaned forward in their seats. Activists in the gallery gripped their phones, already composing tweets. Even the legal aides used to Alsup's antics glanced nervously, sensing that this wasn't going to be business as usual, and Crockett knew it. She knew she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been smirked at, silenced, or dismissed as unworthy of respect. Every word she prepared carried that weight. Every pause was intentional, every glance deliberate. But the question hung in the air. How far was she willing to go? Was this going to be another polite spar, where the judge flexed his authority and walked away unscathed? Or was she about to step into the fire, daring to risk everything in order to prove a point? The answer would come soon enough. And when it did, it wouldn't just catch Alsup off guard. It would leave the entire room reeling, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to survive the moment. She was there to redefine it. And as she drew a breath, preparing to unleash the words that would rewrite the room's balance of power, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning. To understand the impact of Jasmine Crockett's words, you first need to understand the man sitting on the bench that day. Justice William Alsup was no ordinary judge. To many, he was a symbol of authority in its most unyielding form. Sharp-tongued, unflappable, and untouchable. His smirk wasn't just an expression. It was a weapon, one he had honed for decades. In the legal world, Alsup had cultivated a reputation as the man who could cut down any argument with a single dismissive phrase. Lawyers dreaded his interruptions. He would lean forward, cock his head, and with a single sarcastic remark, unravel hours of preparation. What unnerved people wasn't just his intellect. It was the way he seemed to enjoy watching others falter. Over the years, there were countless stories. Attorneys reduced to stammers mid-sentence. Witnesses visibly shaken after his barbed comments. Moments where his courtroom didn't feel like a place of justice, but a stage for his dominance. His admirers called it wit. His critics called it cruelty. But one thing was certain. Alsup believed his authority was unquestionable. That smirk became his signature. It was the quiet signal that he had already dismissed you, that your words, no matter how carefully chosen, held no weight against his judgment. For some, it was intimidating. For others, humiliating. For Alsup, it was victory, and he wore that victory often. His rulings, sometimes biting in tone, carried the same flavor as his demeanor. Sharp, unapologetic, and laced with the subtext that he enjoyed having the final word. He was the embodiment of the old guard. Confident, dismissive of challenges, convinced that power was his by right. But beneath that veneer of control was something else, a blind spot. Years of unchecked authority had bred arrogance. He had grown so accustomed to his smirk working, to his interruptions derailing opponents, that he no longer considered the possibility of resistance. In his courtroom, he was the final arbiter, the immovable object. Or so he thought. That arrogance had consequences. Quietly, resentment grew. Younger attorneys whispered about the unfairness. Community leaders criticized his tone, his tendency to condescend. Activists questioned whether his demeanor represented justice or ego. Yet Alsup brushed it all off with the same confidence he brought to the bench. And so, when Jasmine Crockett stepped into his courtroom, he assumed she would be like all the others. Rattled, hesitant, eventually subdued. The smirk appeared almost instinctively, as if muscle memory had already written the script. Crockett would falter, he would interject, and his authority would remain intact. But what Alsup didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that the landscape had shifted. The world outside his chamber had changed. People were no longer satisfied with arrogance masquerading as wisdom. They weren't looking for intimidation. They were hungry for authenticity, for courage, for voices that refused to be silenced. And Jasmine Crockett was exactly that voice. In his mind, she was just another target. In reality, she was the reckoning he never expected. For all his years of smirks and dismissals, Alsup had never faced someone quite like her. Someone who didn't just resist his authority, but dismantled it piece by piece. Because arrogance, no matter how polished, has one fatal flaw. It assumes invincibility. And in that assumption lies its downfall. On that day, William Alsup's smirk wasn't a sign of power. It was a mask, fragile and brittle, waiting for someone brave enough to crack it. And Jasmine Crockett was about to do just that. Before she ever stood in that courtroom, before she locked eyes with a judge who thought he owned the room, Jasmine Crockett had already lived a lifetime of battles. Battles not fought with gavels or smirks, but with grit, sacrifice, and an unwavering sense of purpose. To understand why she stood so calm before William Alsup, you have to know where that fire came from. Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to being underestimated. From the very start, her journey was paved with voices telling her she wasn't enough. Too young, too bold, too outspoken. In neighborhoods where the promise of opportunity was often overshadowed by systemic barriers, she learned quickly that nothing would be handed to her. If she wanted a place at the table, she would have to carve it out herself. And carve she did. She put herself through school not with privilege, but with persistence. Nights spent studying when others slept, mornings filled with work before classes began. She carried the weight of not just her own dreams, but the dreams of those who believed in her, who saw in her the possibility of breaking ceilings that had been sealed shut for generations. But it wasn't just about books and degrees. Jasmine's true education came from life itself. From the clients she defended who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers, but who deserved the same dignity as anyone else. Because I will not apologize for demanding integrity in this chamber. The gallery couldn't hold back this time. A murmur of approval rippled through the rows. Even those who had come in skeptical now felt the undeniable electricity of the moment. And it wasn't just the words, it was the composure. The contrast between Alsup's brittle attempts at control and Jasmine's calm insistence on dignity was cinematic. The more he tried to assert dominance, the smaller he appeared. The more she stood tall, the larger her presence became. She pressed forward, driving the final nail in. You see, Your Honor, when justice is treated like a performance, where smirks replace substance and arrogance replaces accountability, it doesn't silence me. It fuels me. And I will make sure it fuels everyone watching, everyone listening, everyone who has ever been told their dignity ends where someone else's power begins. For a long, heavy second, Alsup said nothing. The silence was deafening. His smirk was gone. His robe, his bench, his authority, none of it could shield him from the truth laid bare before the entire room. Then, like a spark catching fire, the gallery erupted into whispers and nods, some even daring to clap before being hushed. The energy was unmistakable. Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her case, she had flipped the script. Alsup, flustered, adjusted his glasses, trying to summon composure, but it was too late. The counterattack had landed. The blow wasn't just to his pride, it was to the perception of control itself. Jasmine Crockett had silenced the smirk, not by shouting, not by pleading, but by wielding truth with the kind of force that no robe, no title, no arrogance could withstand. And as the murmurs continued, as the weight of her words settled across the courtroom, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a win for Jasmine Crockett. It was a turning point. But what happened in the hours after, the ripple effects across social media, the commentators, the viral surge of her words, would take this moment from courtroom drama to national reckoning. Because the storm didn't end inside those four walls. It was only beginning. When the gavel finally struck and the proceedings adjourned, it wasn't the usual orderly shuffle out of the courtroom. The energy was alive, buzzing, impossible to contain. People whispered to one another as they filed out, eyes wide, as if they had witnessed not just a hearing, but history itself. What Jasmine Crockett had done in that room wasn't merely an argument. It was a statement, a seismic crack against the marble pillars of arrogance. Outside, the shockwaves began almost instantly. Reporters rushed to their phones, typing furiously, their faces lit by screens as they scrambled to be the first to break the story. Within minutes, headlines blared across news sites. Jasmine Crockett stuns courtroom with fierce rebuttal. Alsup silenced by unexpected counterattack. The moment that turned the tide. Clips of the exchange surfaced online before the ink on the docket could dry. One clip showing the exact moment Jasmine said, "Respect is earned, Your Honor, not demanded," spread like wildfire. It was reposted thousands of times within the first hour. On TikTok, users stitched it into videos, adding captions like, "This is what leadership looks like," and "She said what we've all been waiting to hear." Twitter, or what the world now called X, exploded with hashtags. Silenced smirk, yours Crockett vs Alsup, and simply jar Jasmine trended nationwide. Memes flooded the feed, Alsup's smirk frozen in a still image, next to Jasmine's fierce stare. Others remixed the clip with music, transforming her comeback into an anthem of defiance. And it wasn't just social media users. Prominent figures weighed in. Civil rights leaders praised her courage. A well-known journalist tweeted, "This wasn't just a courtroom exchange. It was a reminder that truth doesn't bow to arrogance." Celebrities amplified her words, ensuring the moment reached millions who might never have otherwise paid attention. Cable news picked it up next. Clips ran on a loop across progressive networks, anchors replaying her words with visible awe. Panelists debated the broader implications. Was this the crack in the armor of institutional arrogance? Could this be the turning point where public servants reminded the judiciary that accountability goes both ways? But perhaps the most powerful validation didn't come from pundits or celebrities. It came from everyday people. Teachers, nurses, students, immigrants. They filled comment sections with their own stories. "She spoke for me," one wrote. Another said, "I've had people smirk at me my whole life, and seeing her shut that down gave me hope." Messages poured in by the thousands. A collective chorus of validation that Jasmine Crockett wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for them. Meanwhile, in corners of the internet that prided themselves on protecting entrenched power, the spin machines whirred. Critics accused her of grandstanding, of disrespect, of crossing a line. Yet even their attempts at condemnation fell flat, because no matter how they framed it, the clip spoke louder than their words. Everyone could see the truth for themselves. Who was calm, who was rattled, who had the courage to stand firm, and while her supporters celebrated, Jasmine herself remained composed. She didn't gloat, didn't seek headlines. She knew the fight wasn't about virality, but about something bigger. The precedent that arrogance in power could and should be challenged. Still, the ripple effects were undeniable. Donations to causes she supported spiked overnight. Invitations to speak poured in. And quietly, behind the scenes, her opponents began whispering about strategy, realizing that silencing her wouldn't be so easy. In living rooms across America, families replayed the clip together, parents telling their children, "See? That's courage. That's how you stand up for what's right." In community centers, it became a rallying cry. In classrooms, it sparked debates not just about law, but about dignity. The courtroom confrontation had become a cultural moment, a moment where people didn't just watch, they participated. They shared, they reacted. They saw themselves reflected in Jasmine Crockett's resilience. And through it all, one thing was clear. William Alsup had entered that courtroom believing his smirk was enough to maintain control. Instead, his smirk had become the symbol of everything Jasmine Crockett had dismantled. But the story wasn't finished. Because beyond the viral clips, beyond the memes and the hashtags, lay the deeper question, what does this moment mean? What lesson could the nation take from a single exchange that left a judge silent and a people inspired? That answer was still to come. And when it did, it wouldn't just be about Jasmine Crockett or William Alsup. It would be about America itself. In the days that followed, the courtroom clash between Justice William Alsup and Jasmine Crockett became more than a trending topic. It became a parable, a story retold at dinner tables, on podcasts, in classrooms, and across countless digital feeds. And at the center of every retelling wasn't just the clash itself, but the moral that emerged from it, because what Jasmine Crockett showed that day was bigger than a single smirk, bigger than one man's arrogance. She revealed a universal truth, that dignity cannot be mocked out of existence, and truth cannot be silenced by power. For years, people had been told to keep their heads down. Don't rock the boat. Don't challenge authority. Wait your turn. But Jasmine's defiance, calm, composed, unshaken, proved the opposite. It showed that real change comes not from waiting politely, but from standing firmly when the moment demands it. Her words, "Respect is earned, Your Honor, not demanded," echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. They became a mantra, a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been told to stay quiet. They reminded people that respect is not a title, not a robe, not a privilege of power. Respect is the product of integrity, and when power tries to demand it without earning it, people have the right, no, the duty to push back. This was the moral heartbeat of the story, that courage does not always roar. Sometimes courage stands calmly in a storm, refusing to bend. Sometimes courage is the ability to speak truth to arrogance without raising your voice. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to let a smirk define your worth. And the lesson didn't end with individuals. It touched the nation, because if a single person could stand against institutional arrogance and win, what could communities do? What could a people united in dignity achieve? Jasmine's moment became a mirror, reflecting not only her strength, but the potential in everyone watching. The narrative also revealed something profound about America itself. This country has always struggled between two forces: the arrogance of power and the resilience of its people. Again and again, history has shown that arrogance smirks, but dignity endures. From civil rights marchers who faced fire hoses, to immigrants who crossed oceans for opportunity, to voices like Jasmine's who refuse to be dismissed, America's progress has always come from those who refuse to bow. And so, as the dust settled, the true meaning of that confrontation emerged. It wasn't about humiliation or spectacle. It was about a shift, a reminder that even in spaces built to intimidate, truth still has the power to silence arrogance. The resolution was not just Jasmine Crockett's victory. It was a victory for everyone who saw themselves in her story, for the young woman who speaks up in a room of doubters, for the immigrant worker who demands fair treatment, for the student who raises their hand even when mocked. Each of them, in their own way, could now say, if she can do it, so can I. From the communities she served where injustice wasn't theoretical, it was daily, grinding, relentless. She walked into courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her, and every time she refused to shrink, she grew sharper, stronger, bolder. This was where her signature style was born, the combination of fire and composure. She could raise her voice when the moment demanded it, but more often, she wielded silence like a blade, letting her opponents reveal their own weakness. She understood something crucial. Power isn't just about volume. It's about conviction. And conviction was something Jasmine Crockett carried in abundance. Her rise wasn't easy, nor was it handed to her. Every position she earned was contested, every victory hard-fought. Critics called her too aggressive, too passionate, too unwilling to play by the unwritten rules. But for Jasmine, those critiques weren't insults. They were proof that she was shaking the ground beneath systems built on arrogance. It was this resilience, this refusal to bow, that propelled her into the national spotlight. People who felt ignored saw in her a voice that didn't just speak for them, but was them. Every immigrant who had been told their accent disqualified them. Every young woman who had been laughed at for speaking up in male-dominated rooms. Every worker whose dignity was dismissed by those in power. Jasmine Crockett carried their stories in her own fight. And so, when she walked into William Alsup's courtroom, she wasn't walking in alone. She carried generations of silenced voices with her. She carried the weight of injustice endured and dignity reclaimed. She carried a fire that had been stoked by every smirk, every laugh, every attempt to dismiss her. That's why her eyes never flinched. That's why her voice carried steady. She had faced far worse than the arrogance of a single judge. She had faced systems built to break her. And still, she stood. Her journey gave her something Alsup would never understand: the ability to draw strength from struggle. Where he leaned on authority, she leaned on resilience. Where he relied on intimidation, she relied on truth. Where he believed smirks could silence, she believed dignity could outlast. And that belief wasn't abstract, it was lived. Every scar, every setback, every small victory stitched into her story had prepared her for this very moment. So, When people wondered how she found the composure to stand her ground in the face of his arrogance, the answer was simple. She had been standing her ground her entire life. This wasn't just Jasmine Crockett versus William Alsup. This was Jasmine Crockett versus every smirk that had ever tried to erase her worth, every condescending laugh that told her she didn't belong, every barrier that said, "Not you, not here, not now." And for once, the chamber that had silenced so many was about to hear a voice it couldn't ignore, because Jasmine Crockett's story wasn't about surviving the system. It was about rewriting it. The air inside the courtroom thickened as the exchange moved from subtle tension to open confrontation. William Alsup leaned back in his chair, his smirk sharpening into a weapon. It was the kind of look designed to dismiss, to say without words, "You're out of your depth here." He thought the robe gave him unshakable authority. He thought the smirk would rattle her, but Jasmine Crockett was not rattled. She stood firm, her hands steady, her expression unflinching. Her voice carried a calmness that only heightened the contrast. Calm not born of surrender, but of absolute certainty. Alsup's words dripped with condescension. He framed her argument as naive, her evidence as weak, her presence as a nuisance. Each sentence was delivered like a hammer striking down from the bench. "Counselor," he drawled, "perhaps you've misunderstood the precedent." The gallery stirred. They'd seen this tactic before. It wasn't about the law. It was about putting her in her place. But Jasmine refused to move. With every patronizing jab, she responded not with volume, but with precision. She dissected his interruptions with measured clarity, each point she raised tightening the noose around his casual dismissals. For every smirk he gave, she returned the steady gaze of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to reveal. The tension grew visible. The audience could feel it. This was no longer a routine proceeding. It had become a duel between authority assumed and authority earned. Alsup leaned forward now, abandoning the veil of neutrality. His tone hardened. "So you're suggesting, Ms. Crockett, that this court has somehow overlooked the facts?" His question wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was a trap, a challenge meant to box her in. And that's when the atmosphere shifted. Jasmine took a deliberate pause. She let the silence hang, her refusal to rush an answer unnerving in its own right. The gallery leaned in. Even Alsup's smirk faltered for a split second. Then she spoke. "Not overlooked, Your Honor." Ignored. The word cracked through the courtroom like thunder. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. For a moment, even Alsup's face stiffened. The smirk interrupted by disbelief. She hadn't just parried his jab. She had struck at the very core of his authority. The escalation was no longer subtle. It was open, raw, undeniable. His questions became sharper, but her answers became sharper still. Every word she spoke carried the weight of lived truth, every rebuttal a scalpel cutting through layers of arrogance. The duel was lopsided in a way no one expected. Alsup had the bench, the robe, the title. But Jasmine Crockett had the conviction, the composure, the moral gravity that pulled the audience into her orbit. The more he tried to diminish her, the more his tactics exposed themselves as shallow, brittle, outdated. The gallery's energy shifted, too. Whispers turned into nods, nods into silent affirmation. People weren't just witnessing a debate. They were witnessing a turning tide. Alsup, sensing the room slipping from his control, raised his voice, trying to regain dominance. "This line of reasoning is bordering on disrespect," he warned, but Jasmine didn't flinch. Her reply was calm, steady, almost surgical. "Respect is earned, Your Honor, not demanded." That line was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The gallery gasped again, some covering their mouths, others struggling to hide smiles. The tension was no longer abstract. It was palpable, electric, undeniable. And though the escalation had reached its peak, the true explosion was still to come. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just holding her ground. She was preparing for the counterstrike that would leave William Alsup stunned and utterly silent. The room held its breath. The tension that had been mounting for minutes now felt unbearable, like the moment before a storm unleashes its fury. Justice William Alsup's smirk lingered, but it was no longer effortless. Beneath the polished exterior of authority, a flicker of irritation broke through. He had expected her to stumble. He had expected hesitation. What he hadn't expected was Jasmine Crockett, unyielding, deliberate, and ready to strike. And then it came. Her voice cut through the silence with the kind of clarity that demands attention. Calm, resonant, unwavering. "Your Honor," she began, "when the dignity of the law is weaponized to diminish the people it claims to serve, it ceases to be justice. It becomes performance." The gallery stirred. This wasn't legal jargon. This was a direct hit wrapped in eloquence. Every word landed not only on Alsup, but on the audience. A collective reminder that this wasn't about abstract statutes. It was about truth, about fairness, about the line between power and abuse. Alsup shifted in his chair, fingers tightening on the armrest. "Counselor," he started, but Jasmine wasn't finished. "Let me be clear," she pressed on, her tone rising just enough to ride over his interruption. "I did not come here to beg this court for validation. I came here to remind it of its obligation. And that obligation is not to protect egos, not to shield power from accountability, but to uphold justice. Real justice. The kind that ordinary people can believe in." The smirk vanished. For the first time, William Alsup's expression hardened into something else. Irritation struggling to disguise itself as control. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jasmine was already ahead. "You asked if I was suggesting this court had overlooked the facts. I said no. What I'm saying is worse. The facts are here. The truth is here. And yet time and again, when the powerful stand to lose, somehow the law bends. Somehow the facts blur. Somehow justice hesitates. And I'm here to say, not this time." The audience erupted, not with noise, but with energy. Heads nodded, eyes widened, shoulders leaned forward. This was the counterattack they hadn't just hoped for, but needed. She paced slowly, every step intentional, not rushed, as though controlling the tempo of the entire room. "You can smirk at me, Your Honor. You can dismiss me as loud, as unpolished, as unfit for your courtroom decorum. But what you cannot dismiss are the truths I've laid before you. You cannot dismiss the evidence. You cannot dismiss the people I represent, and you cannot dismiss the fact that history will record this moment, whether this court stood on the side of justice or on the side of arrogance." The words hung in the air like thunderclaps. Alsup leaned forward now, almost defensive. "Counselor, you are bordering dangerously close to contempt," he warned, his voice sharper than before. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't retreat. She leaned in too, her eyes locked onto his, her voice dropping to a lower register that made every word land heavier. "Respectfully, Your Honor, contempt is earned when a court loses its way. And if defending truth invites your contempt, then I'll wear it proudly." And in that way, Jasmine's comeback was more than a mic drop moment. It was a torch passed on, a signal flare in the darkness, reminding people everywhere that silence in the face of injustice is not an option. But the story still needed one last piece, a call to action. Because inspiration is powerful, but only if it moves people to act. The question remained, would viewers let this be just another viral clip, or would they carry its lesson into their own lives? The answer was waiting in the outro, where Jasmine's story would turn from courtroom drama into an invitation. A call to build a future where no smirk, no robe, no arrogance could silence the truth again. And so, the smirk that was meant to belittle became the very symbol of defeat. Justice William Alsup thought he could dismiss Jasmine Crockett with a look, with a laugh, with the casual arrogance of authority. Instead, he was left in silence, stripped not of his title, but of his pretense. Because when truth speaks with courage, even power must listen. But this story isn't just about one courtroom, one judge, or one comeback. It's about a greater fight. The fight for dignity in a world that too often confuses power with respect. Jasmine Crockett's words weren't crafted for a headline. They were spoken for every person who's ever been underestimated, ignored, or dismissed. And that's where you come in. Because this moment, this clash, this comeback, this silenced smirk is bigger than her and bigger than him. It belongs to all of us. To the students who refuse to shrink, to the workers who demand fairness, to the families who fight for their place in the American story. If you felt something watching this unfold, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it. Carry its lesson forward. Because arrogance will smirk again, and power will try to silence truth again. But every time it does, it is up to us, together, to ensure dignity speaks louder. So join this movement. Subscribe, stay connected, and be part of a community that believes in truth over arrogance, justice over performance, and courage over silence. Because when Jasmine Crockett stood tall, she didn't just silence a smirk. She reminded America of something timeless, that respect is never demanded. It is earned, and together we can make sure it is earned every single time.